Watch this leaf. It shouldn't be dying, and yet here it is, giving up one cell at a time. 14 square feet, 3 plastic pots, 1 tomato plant losing a war nobody told her she'd have to fight. She built a schedule for it, taped it to the fridge like a hospital chart, the way you'd track medication for something you love and can't afford to lose. She read everything: sunlight hours, soil pH, the internet's entire encyclopedia on keeping a tomato alive. And still they came back. Every morning the same small green invaders, patient as tide. 6:15, before coffee, before work, wiping aphids off a stem like she was the last line of defense in a war fought one leaf at a time. And somewhere in that defeat, a belief took root instead of a plant. The quiet certainty that real growing, the kind that actually feeds a person, needs land she simply doesn't have and never will. Now follow the light. It lands somewhere else entirely. Same city, same size balcony, give or take a foot. Same relentless sun, same traffic murmuring up from the same street below. And yet this 14 square feet is producing more food than most backyards manage in 400. Tomatoes heavy enough to need help standing. Basil thick enough to fill a mason jar every single week. Not one dead leaf, not one insect bite, not one sign of the war being fought 7 floors away on the other side of the same skyline. The difference isn't the pots, it isn't the sunlight, it isn't luck, and it certainly isn't magic. The difference is a notebook older than the woman who owns it now, written in handwriting that belonged to someone else entirely, following rules she was never once taught in any class or article. And by the time this story ends, you will understand exactly what's written on that page, because it works whether you're standing on 400 acres or 14 square feet of railing above a parking lot. Her name is Hannah, and 3 months ago, gardening was the last thing on her mind. She was thinking about her grandmother instead, gone that spring, and everything she'd left behind now folded into 11 cardboard boxes in a storage unit 2 states from the farm where she'd raised her family. Hannah drove out on a Saturday expecting photographs, old letters maybe, a quilt if she was lucky enough to still find one intact. She wasn't expecting the notebook. It had been tucked away like something precious, held together with a piece of string gone stiff with age. No title, just her grandmother's initials carved there with something sharp, long before Hannah was ever born. Inside, page after page of careful, cramped handwriting, dates, sketches, lists of plant names paired together in 2s and 3s, joined by small hand-drawn arrows Hannah couldn't yet read. One page held 2 words circled together. Another held 3 names arranged in a triangle, the word sisters scrawled in the margin so hard the pen had nearly torn through the paper. She sat there for almost an hour, turning pages that made no sense to her yet, in a unit that smelled like dust and old cedar. Her grandmother hadn't grown up on some sprawling estate. She'd grown up on a small Amish farm, where every square foot of soil had to earn its keep, and nothing was ever planted simply because it looked nice standing alone. Because on farms like that one, nothing was ever planted alone by accident. Hannah's grandmother learned that kneeling in a row exactly like this one, watching her own mother's hands move plant to plant, the way you'd memorize a language before you knew you were learning one. Nobody ever explained why. There was no science pinned to a wall on that farm, no chart, no book with answers in it. There was only a finger pointing at 2 plants growing side by side and a voice saying, "These 2 look out for each other," the way you'd talk about old friends, not vegetables. Whatever was actually happening underground, invisible between those roots, would take her granddaughter decades, a cardboard box, and 1 cramped city balcony to finally understand. Back home, Hannah scrolled through her own graveyard of balcony failures from summers past. A pepper plant that never cleared 6 inches, A tomato that gave her exactly 4 fruit before the aphids picked it apart from the inside out. She'd done everything the way she'd been told. One plant, one pot, spaced neatly apart so nothing would compete for root space. It had never once occurred to her that the spacing itself might be the problem, that the loneliness of one plant in one pot, with nothing beside it, might be exactly what kept it dying. And then she remembered something she'd almost forgotten. The summer before, one pepper plant had done strangely well compared to the others, better than any pepper she'd grown before or since. She hadn't planned it that way. A basil plant she'd meant to move had simply stayed crowded beside it for weeks, and she'd never once thought twice about it. What she didn't know yet was that underground, in that one accidental pot, something had been happening that had nothing to do with luck at all. Roots don't just drink water and anchor a plant in the dark. They release invisible chemical signals into the soil around them, message after message, that a plant standing alone in bare earth never gets the chance to send, or to receive at all. Her grandmother's notebook, it turned out, was already full of pairings that made that exact happy accident happen on purpose, page after page, plant after plant. Take the very first pairing Hannah found circled in her grandmother's notebook, tomato and basil. On the surface, that looks like nothing more than a happy kitchen accident, since the two taste incredible together on a plate. But underground, and in the very air around the leaves, something else entirely is happening. Basil releases a scent that pests use to hunt their next meal. And that scent, mixed in close with a tomato plant, scrambles the exact chemical trail an aphid or a hornworm would normally follow straight to it. It isn't a fence, it isn't a spray. It's confusion planted on purpose, dressed up as a garnish. Picture 2 identical pots. Same tomato variety, same sun, same water scheduled down to the hour. One grows completely alone. The other wears a ring of basil at its base like armor. Within 3 weeks, the lonely tomato is covered in aphids, curling in on itself like it's flinching. The one with basil beside it barely shows a mark. Same conditions, same care. The only difference standing between a struggling plant and a thriving one is a single companion, planted 8 inches away. That pairing worked well enough that Hannah kept turning pages, hunting for whatever else her grandmother had spent a lifetime quietly discovering. That's when she found the triangle. 3 names this time, not 2, with the word sisters, underlined so hard it had almost torn the page. She'd heard the phrase before. Somewhere a documentary, maybe, or a conversation she'd only half caught at the time. The 3 sisters. Corn, beans, and squash, grown together the way certain communities have done for centuries, long before her grandmother's own family ever adopted the practice. In an open field, the logic is almost poetic. The corn stands tall, offering the bean vines a living trellis they never have to buy. The beans, in return, pull nitrogen from the air itself and feed it steadily into the soil, fertilizing the corn and the squash without anyone lifting a single bag of store-bought fertilizer. And the squash spreads its broad leaves low across the ground, choking out weeds and locking moisture into the soil so none of the 3 sisters ever go thirsty, even through a hard, dry stretch. 3 plants, 3 separate jobs, one shared patch of earth, doing more together than any of them could ever manage alone, a partnership older than any farm her grandmother ever worked. Which left Hannah with an obvious, sinking problem, the kind that makes an idea feel like it was never meant for you at all. She had 14 square feet of railing above a parking lot. She did not have a field. Full corn stalks would tower over her balcony, blotting out every bit of light from everything planted near them. There simply wasn't room for a system built for open ground to survive inside a handful of plastic pots stacked against a railing. For a moment, she assumed the whole idea simply wasn't meant for someone like her, One more piece of her grandmother's wisdom that belonged to farms and fields, not apartments 7 floors up. But near the back of the notebook, in handwriting gone noticeably shakier, written years after the earlier pages, Hannah found something entirely different. Her grandmother, later in life, had clearly downsized. These entries weren't about fields anymore. They were about pots, about porches. The sisters made smaller, she'd written, in ink slightly different from the rest. She had already solved this exact problem decades before Hannah was born, back when her own body could no longer manage a full field, and she'd had to bring everything she knew down onto a porch instead. The trick was never shrinking the corn. It was replacing the job the corn used to do. Instead of a stalk of corn for the beans to climb, a simple trellis, a few sticks, or even a length of leftover fencing wire pushed into the soil, gave the beans exactly the same support in a fraction of the space. The beans still fixed nitrogen into the soil exactly the way they always had, feeding whatever grew around them for free. And instead of squash sprawling across an entire field, a compact bush variety could trail gently over the pot's edge, shading the soil just enough to keep it from drying out under a hard afternoon sun. 3 sisters, 3 jobs, and not one of them needed to change what it was actually doing, only where it stood to do it. Hannah built her first pot exactly like that. 1 trellis, a handful of bean seeds pressed into the soil, 1 small squash plant tucked near the edge, waiting to spill over. It looked strange at first, crowded, almost messy, nothing like the neat, single-plant pots she was used to lining up in a tidy row. But within a few weeks, the beans had climbed halfway up the trellis on their own, and the squash leaves had already started reaching for the edge, exactly the way her grandmother's shaky handwriting had promised they would. The next page led her somewhere she never expected, to a flower most people only think of as decoration. Marigolds. Hannah had always assumed they were only there for color, the kind of flower you plant along a border because it's cheerful and easy and asks for nothing. Her grandmother's notes told a different story entirely. Underground, marigold roots release a compound that certain soil pests, microscopic worms called nematodes, simply cannot tolerate. Plant marigolds near the base of a vegetable, and those pests move on entirely, choosing an easier target instead of pushing through soil that's actively working against them. It's easy to miss this kind of damage, because it happens exactly where nobody's looking. A plant struggling from root damage doesn't announce it. It just slowly stops thriving, wilts a little more every week, and eventually gets written off as one that simply didn't take. Hannah realized, looking back, that this was probably what had happened to at least 2 of her own past failures, pepper plants she'd blamed on bad luck, when the real damage had been happening entirely out of sight, underground, the whole time. The last major pairing in the notebook was the one that made the least sense to Hannah at first, because it seemed to work by inviting trouble in, rather than keeping it out. Nasturtiums, bright, trailing flowers that aphids find almost impossible to resist. Her grandmother had written a single line beside the sketch of one. Let them have this one instead. A nasturtium planted at the edge of a pot doesn't repel a single pest. It sacrifices itself instead, pulling aphids toward its own leaves and away from the vegetables growing beside it, like a decoy standing guard at the edge of camp. The only job the nasturtium ever asks in return is a quick check, once a week. Aphids gather there, exactly where they're supposed to, and a light spray of water knocks them off before their numbers ever get out of hand. It takes less than a minute, and it's the only pest control the entire balcony needs from that point on. No chemical spray. No trip to a garden store for a bright yellow bottle promising to solve a problem one flower was already handling for free. Piece by piece, pairing by pairing, Hannah's balcony stopped looking like a row of separate pots. It started looking like something closer to a small, tangled neighborhood. Tomatoes with basil circling their base. Beans climbing trellises with squash trailing beneath. Marigolds tucked along the pepper pots. A nasturtium standing guard by the railing, taking whatever damage came so nothing else had to. None of this meant throwing every plant together at random, though. Hannah learned that the hard way. The first time she placed a sun-hungry tomato in the shadiest corner of the balcony, tucked beside the door where the building next door blocked half the afternoon light. It sulked there for 2 weeks before she finally moved it. The pairings only work when each plant is also getting what it individually needs to begin with. The tomatoes and marigolds claim the sunniest stretch along the railing, while the basil, which tolerates a little shade just fine, filled in the corners that got less direct light. Companionship solved the pest problem. Placement solved everything else. 6 weeks after she started, Hannah stood at her railing with a cup of coffee, in the exact spot where she used to check on one dying tomato plant every morning before work. There was no single plant to check on anymore. There was a whole small system, working together the way her grandmother had quietly worked it out over a lifetime of trial and error, on a farm 2 states away, and somehow, standing here, that distance didn't feel so far at all. The tomatoes hadn't just survived, they'd outgrown their cage. The basil beside them had gone from a few sprigs to more than she could use in a week. And not once in 6 weeks had she needed to buy a single bottle of pesticide. It would be easy to call this a trick, something clever her grandmother happened to stumble onto by accident. But that's not really what this is. This is what growing looked like before anyone decided plants needed to be separated, spaced apart, and treated like isolated little machines, each one boxed into its own private container with its own private set of instructions. For most of human history, on farms exactly like the one her grandmother grew up on, nothing was ever expected to grow entirely alone. Every plant had a neighbor, and every neighbor had a purpose, whether that purpose was climbing, shading, feeding the soil, confusing a pest, or simply taking a hit meant for something else. Nobody ever mentioned any of this the day Hannah bought her first tomato plant from the hardware store, price tag still clinging to the pot. A little plastic marker pushed into the soil, instructions printed on it like a recipe, water twice a week, space 14 inches apart, full sun. That tag never once mentioned a neighbor, never mentioned basil or marigolds or a nasturtium standing guard at the corner of the pot, quietly taking a hit meant for something else. It just told her, the same way it told every other renter on every other balcony in the city, to keep her plant alone. Multiply that one small tag by every plant on every rack in every store like it, and you start to understand how an entire generation of balcony gardeners ended up believing the same quiet lie Hannah once believed, that their space was simply too small to produce anything meaningful. Not because it was true, because nobody selling them a single plant in a single pot had any reason to mention the neighbor that plant was missing. 14 square feet, it turned out, had never been the problem. The problem was that every plant on it had been standing alone. That's the whole idea, boiled down to its simplest form. 14 square feet can behave like an entire acre if the right plants are standing shoulder to shoulder inside it, each one doing a job the others can't do for themselves. You don't need more space, you need better neighbors. And the pairings that make that possible were figured out generations ago, patiently, through decades of trial and error on farms where nothing could ever afford to be wasted, then passed down the same way Hannah's grandmother passed hers down. Not through a class, not through an article, through a notebook held together with string, waiting in a box for someone to finally open it. Hannah has started adding her own pages now, right beneath her grandmother's. New pairings she's tried. Small notes about what worked in a north-facing pot versus a south-facing one. details specific to a city balcony her grandmother, working an open field, never once had to think about. The notebook isn't finished. It was never supposed to be. It's the kind of thing that gets picked back up by whoever comes next, added to, corrected, and carried forward, the same way it was carried to her. If you've been standing at your own railing, looking at your own small patch of pots, wondering if real growing is simply something that belongs to people with more land than you have, you already know the answer now. It was never about the land. It was never about the size of the pot or the number of square feet you've been given to work with. It's about which plants you choose to place beside each other, and whether you let them work the way they were always meant to together, instead of alone. You don't need a farm 2 states away. You don't need decades of handwriting held together with string. You need 1 pot, and 2 plants that were always supposed to stand beside each other instead of alone. Whatever's still sitting on your own railing right now, wilting a little more every morning before you leave for work, it isn't broken, and it isn't your fault. It's just been lonely, and out of everything in this entire story, that turns out to be the easiest thing to fix. But planting the right neighbors is only half the story. Because even the healthiest balcony garden in the world will eventually hand you more tomatoes, more beans, and more herbs than you could possibly eat in a single week, piling up in bowls faster than any one person could reasonably keep up with. And what Hannah's grandmother did with that exact surplus, using nothing but jars, salt, and a countertop, is a secret entirely its own. One that kept a family fed through winters when nothing at all was growing outside, a secret written in the same steady hand as everything that came before it. That's next.